Believe it or not, this giant circuit board is actually a functioning Game Boy Color made by Nintendo. And even more interesting is that when you turn it on, it has a previously never before seen boot screen. Now this is the Game Boy Color boot screen that we're all used to seeing. But sometime during the development of the Game Boy Color, Nintendo made and distributed this prototype development board, which had what I can only assume to be an early version of the Game Boy Color with a different firmware. The only other example of this showing up online is from a heritage auction of one that sold for $14,000 a couple years ago. Not sure if it's worth that kind of money given the track record of heritage auctions. Now, in addition to this odd-looking board, I've been sent some other very unique and also never before seen Nintendo development hardware for the Game Boy Color. So, without any further ado, let's dive right in and take a look. Hey everyone, how's it going? My name is Tito and welcome to Macho Nacho Productions. Today, I got something really special in the studio. And it's this complete suite of Game Boy Color development hardware. All this was sent over by a longtime friend of the channel, Andrew, who's an avid collector of all things video game development. Andrew was super kind and lent all this hardware to me so that I can show you all this really unique and quite frankly, very rare Nintendo development hardware. We'll be going over each of these items in detail in just a moment and also open them up to take a peek underneath the hood. I'll even demonstrate how each one works, and we'll kind of get a glimpse of what it may have been like for Game Boy Color developers back in the late 90s and early 2000s. Alright, let's first take a look at this. This is the is-cgb-emulator, a device that allows developers to load development builds of games onto one of these debugger units so that they can test them out on actual hardware. These are made by Intelligent Systems, which not only manufacture development hardware for Nintendo, but also produced games as well, such as the Paper Mario series. Now what makes this particular unit so unique is the fact that it's an early version A model, which seems to only support Game Boy Color development. Later revisions of this emulator unit, which are more common, also support Game Boy Advance games. So the fact that this only supports Game Boy Color is rather unique. Around back we see various I/O, such as the power port, which uses a Super Nintendo power supply, and a couple SCSI ports to connect the device to a PC, as well as a few dip switches to change various settings. And around front, we have a cartridge port, which I'm told is for loading ROMs onto test cards like this one here, and not for playing games. So you just can't pop in Pokemon and play. This IDE-looking connector is for hooking up an actual Game Boy Color debugging unit so that you can play the game directly on representative hardware. Don't worry, I will demonstrate how this all works later on in the video, and it's actually pretty neat, so stay tuned. Now let's take a peek under the hood. The top of the case is held on with only a few screws on the bottom and the rear of the unit. Once they're all out, the top case just slides right off. And here you can actually see a large thermal pad, which is meant to keep this large looking chip here nice and cool. This Xilinx chip is an FPGA, the same technology that powers the Analog Pocket and the MiSTer project. Although I'm sure this one is not as advanced given it's from 1998. According to its data sheet, it has about 1800 logic elements, which when compared to the Analog Pocket's 49,000, or the MiSTer Project's DE10's 110,000 logic elements, the is-cgb emulator just seems paltry in comparison. But again, it's from 1998. Anyway, another notable thing is the fact that this has a removable stick of SIM memory, which to me means this is something that may have been an upgradable option. Now, I'm not going to go through every chip here, but I will talk about this one here. It's a Nintendo branded chip called the NVC-VUE, and the reason it's noteworthy is because it's the same chip used in a Virtual Boy. I think it's kind of interesting that Nintendo is utilizing this chip for Game Boy Color development, and I'm curious what its intended purpose is. If you have any idea what it's used for, let me know down below in the comments. Alright, so that's the is-cgb emulator. But now let's move on and take a quick look at the debugging units. Now I was sent two of these, and by and large they're identical. However, this purple one is the more interesting one. These essentially are fully functioning Game Boy Color units that interface with the IS emulator using this special cartridge called the Probe that not only provides data connection, but also powers the Game Boy itself through this connector here. Taking a close look at the battery compartment, we can see that this is an early revision of the Game Boy Color shell since it's missing the battery indicator markings like you'd find on a retail unit. And if we open this one up, we can see that the model number for this board shows a X3 designation instead of just a revision number like on a retail board. The X letter was used by Nintendo internally to designate prototypes. So this Game Boy Color debugging unit is using a prototype motherboard. Very cool. And inside the other unit, we see that it's using just a standard retail board. Anyway, that's the debugging units. Now before we take a look at the most interesting piece of hardware in the lot, the prototype development board, let's talk about the sponsor of today's video, PCBWay. If you have an idea for a new mod or want to assemble an open source project, PCBWay provides you with the tools to make them a reality. From 3D printing services in an array of materials, all the way to other services like CNC machining, injection molding, and of course PCB and flex ribbon fabrication. So when it comes to taking your retro gaming mods to the next level, PCBWay is the place to make that happen. Check out the link in the description for PCBWay to get $5 off your first order. And again, a huge thank you to PCBWay for sponsoring this video. Alright, with that out of the way, let's take a close look at this prototype development board called the CGB-STB-X2. Now for some of you, this board may actually look kind of familiar, and that's because its younger, more powerful sibling, the Game Boy Advance version of this board, has been covered several times before. The only coverage I could find on this particular board was a listing on the Heritage Auction site, which featured some footage of it being used, as well as a few photos of the device on the Handheld Museum website. So really, I'm just honored to be able to give you guys a more in-depth look at this fascinating prototype from Nintendo. Now the reason we know that this actually is a prototype is again because of the X designation silkscreened onto the board. And what's even more fascinating is that when we boot the system up, we get this blue splash screen with the Nintendo logo, not the iconic Game Boy Color splash screen that we're all accustomed to. This tells me a few things. First being, this is an early build of not only the hardware, but also the firmware. Just to demonstrate, when I attempt to play an early game from the original Game Boy library, Tetris in this case, we can see that it works fine. But if I attempt to play later games for the Game Boy Color, such as this copy of Pokemon Crystal, well, I get a bunch of glitches, and the game is essentially unplayable. These glitches are most likely present because the firmware loaded onto this prototype development board doesn't represent the final retail version, which causes compatibility issues with a ton of newer titles. To me, this makes this hardware really unique in that it is an extremely early prototype development board. So early in fact that it's not even usable with pretty much all the Game Boy Color games that I tried playing. Anyway, let's take a look around this fascinating piece of tech. Starting at the top left, we have the IR transceiver, a notable feature of the Game Boy Color. And over to the right of it is the game cart connector and link port. Moving down, we have the volume knob, speaker, headphone jack, and power connector, which appears to simply be a hacked up one from a Super Nintendo. You can see where they literally trimmed the plastic off the shroud. Really funny how Nintendo recycled parts from other consoles to make these boards. The power switch and power LED are here, and then to the left we have this interesting array of buttons that actually allow you to play games. Not super practical, but they are absolutely 100% functional. If you follow the traces of these buttons, they lead to these through holes here, which I'm told allow you to wire up an external controller, such as a Super Nintendo pad. And right above the buttons is the TFT display. And right here, we have what I believe to be the Sharp LR35902 CPU, but I can't tell since this one doesn't have any markings like you would find on a retail chip. And scattered throughout the board are a ton of test point arrays for what I can only assume to be for debugging. Alright, so that's cool and all, but now let's try to actually use the equipment all connected together. To demonstrate the hardware, Andrew also sent over this period correct Toshiba laptop from the mid-90s with Windows 98 and all the necessary development software installed. So to start off, we'll first connect the emulator unit using the SCSI cable, which hooks up to the PC via this PCM CIA card. Once that's all hooked up, I'll connect the debugging handheld unit to the emulator, and then power it on. It's important to first power on the IS emulator before turning on the PC, otherwise the development software won't be able to detect the emulator device. Okay, with the emulator on, we can now power on the PC. After it boots up, we can open the is-cgb-emulator software, which is what will allow us to communicate with the emulator unit itself. And if I select File, then Open, a file read window displays, and what we're interested in is the Bin tab. If we hit Browse, we can see that Andrew already has a few games loaded, so let's check out Mario DX. Press Open, then OK. We are then presented with a memory setting warning, and here we can execute different cartridge parameters. Remember, not every Game Boy game is the same, and there are several different cart types, with each having their own set of features. For example, Final Fantasy Adventure uses a MBC2 chip, while games like Pokemon Crystal that feature an internal clock and save function use a MBC3 chip. Anyway, for Super Mario Deluxe, we need to select MBC5 because that's what it uses. Then hit OK. Once the prompt says read OK, we can then power on the Game Boy debugging unit. And would you look at that, Super Mario Deluxe loads right up, and we can start playing. Let's try another game, Pokemon Crystal. This time, we need to select MBC3 to load the game. And it comes right up. Now let's say for example that I load the incorrect memory bank controller or MBC chip type. For example, instead of MBC3, I load MBC1. Well, once it's loaded and I power on the debugger, you can see that nothing happens. It's important, obviously, to set the correct environment in order to get the games to function correctly. So this is pretty much the extent to which I'm able to use the development hardware. This is of course an oversimplification of what these devices are capable of, but at least you get a sense of how these things work and perhaps an idea of how developers use these kits. Now we can actually also hook up the X2 target board to the IS emulator unit. It uses a similar probe to the debugging handheld units, but it also needs to be powered externally with the Super Nintendo power supply. And it essentially works the same way. We load a game, power on the board, and play the game. You can see that loading an older game like Tetris works great. However, again, when I try to load something newer for the Game Boy Color like Pokemon Pinball, while it initially looks like it's working, it eventually freezes and the screen goes blank. Trying another original Game Boy game, such as Wario Land, again seems to work. So for this prototype board, it appears as though they were able to get some backwards compatibility with original Game Boy games, but they still haven't worked out all the kinks when it comes to the newer Game Boy Color games. Again, the fact that it doesn't fully work really makes this a cool piece of gaming history. Now, another thing about this board that's pretty neat, which I've already demonstrated early on in the video, is that it's also a standalone testing unit, meaning it doesn't need to be hooked up to the IS emulator in order to work like the debugging units. Although the major caveat is that it pretty much doesn't work with most games. I plugged in a bunch of different games and most of them didn't work properly. I was able to get my EverDrive to work, although it was pretty inconsistent. Needless to say, I wouldn't try using this as a way to play games, as it's definitely more of a unique and very cool piece of history. Well folks, there you have it. A peek behind the curtain, so to speak, at the tools game developers used back in the day to make the games we love for the Game Boy Color. If you enjoyed this video, I really think you'll like this one here, so check it out. And as always, thank you all so much for tuning in today, and I'll catch you again next Thursday.